Doing starting recording. Do you have a notification?
Notification? What do you mean?
Does it say Yuri's recording the call?
I'm trying to see whether there's anything that I can print, not print, that I can click on. I hear you, I see you.
Okay.
So I suppose it's working.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, all right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's hope it is.
Yeah.
All righty. Okay, everybody, welcome back to part 2 of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we are continuing our conversation with Alfred Zayas, who was remind me your title, the Special Rapporteur on Sanctions on Venezuela, or...
I certainly wrote the leading piece on sanctions on Venezuela, but in a different function, because my official title was independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. And of course, it's evident that unilateral coercive measures are incompatible with a democratic and equitable international order. So that fell within my purview. But since 2015, we have a special rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, the first one being Idris Yasairi, his successor being Professor Alena Doha. Then I cooperate with them and I transmit to her a lot of material that I receive, but I let them do their thing. On the other hand, it was part of my responsibility when in November, December 2017, I traveled to Venezuela, and I was, in fact, and still am, the first United Nations rapporteur to have officially visited Venezuela in 21 years. I mean, I have recommended that other rapporteurs be invited, and Venezuela did invite 2 others. One of them, the rapporteur on the right to development, is planning to go, and the rapporteur on sanctions, Idris Yasairi, had accepted the invitation, was going to know, and unfortunately, on the 27th of February of this year, 2020, he passed away of cancer. Yes, I mean, I was very...
Oh, did he?
Idris passed away. I was at his funeral, and
I'm very sorry to hear. Very sorry to hear about that.
It was a great man, great man. I had enormous respect for him, and he had a lot of courage. He wrote fantastic reports.
And it was it was nice that his last legacy that that he left was condemning the sanctions on Venezuela.
Well, I mean, you have to. Why? They're totally incompatible with the United Nations Charter. They're incompatible with international law. The United Nations has, for the last 20 odd years, issued resolution after resolution condemning unilateral coercive measures. Back in the year 2000, Professor Marc Passoit from the University of Antwerp, Marc Passoit, who was also the president of the Belgian Constitutional Court, in his function as independent expert in the then subcommission on the promotion and protection of human rights, he wrote the leading report on the issue of sanctions. That was year 2000. And it's a report that has not been topped since. It lays down why the prohibition of sanctions, and also the issue of state responsibility. Because if a state imposes sanctions unilaterally on another country and the other country suffers significant damage, including death, including the whole dislocation of the economy, that is what you term in international law jargon an internationally wrongful act. And that calls for reparation. I mean, there's a principle of restitutio in integrum, which has been developed by the United Nations International Law Commission. And obviously, if you commit a violation of international law, that has both civil and penal consequences. In the case of Venezuela, uh,
Yeah, that's a perfect segue then to my first two questions. To my first question on Venezuela. So okay, so my first question then is when you went to Venezuela to meet to meet people from all walks of life. You met the poor, you met the middle class, you met the very affluent. You met with supporters of
the
Maduro.
churches and the churches, they play a role.
Yeah, yeah. And you met supporters of Maduro as well as the opposition on both the left and the right. And of course you went to study the effects of sanctions on Venezuela. So the first question, so my first question is, uh, describe what you feel is the situation in Venezuela. What was it prior to, and what was it prior to the sanctions, and then of course you can explain the the impact of Western sanctions on Venezuela, on the Maduro government. So yeah, so that's my first broad question then.
Well, let's review the history. For the last 100 years, Venezuela has been dependent on the sale of oil as its major economic source, its major source of foreign currency. It's a mistake. Venezuela should have diversified. Hugo Chavez wanted to diversify. But again, Hugo Chavez was not a communist. Hugo Chavez did not make the Venezuelan economy into a communist economy like Cuba did. He let the oil industry, the minerals industry, gold, bauxite, coltan, and all of that in private hands. So they were running.
Thank you, by the way, for clarifying that, because many people depict Hugo Chavez and his successor Maduro as communist dictators.
Well, certainly not dictators, because that is a total misnomer. Um, Chavez was elected with a very substantial majority, and he was elected again and again and again. And Maduro was elected with a narrow majority, but notwithstanding. And the challenges to the uh, elections in Venezuela, in particular, to the elections of Maduro in 2013, 2014, 2018, are not valid. I mean, I spent hours and hours with the head of the Electoral Commission, and I spoke with a considerable number of election monitors. As you know,
And
at the time,
we're talking about the 90s and early 2000s, or
no, going into the challenged elections of Maduro in 2013, 2014, 2018, I have spoken with uh, election monitors who went there. There's a Latin American association that specializes on election monitoring only in Latin America, made up by the presidents of the various election commissions of these countries. And they ratified again and again that there was no fraud and that the elections were proper. The In the early 2000s, Jimmy Carter himself and the Carter Center uh, monitored 4 elections, and they gave top grades to the electoral system of Venezuela. The mess that we have seen in the United States recently, whether it be Minnesota or Florida or whatever, could not happen in Venezuela because of their system. Actually, has a lot of double checking so that it works. Problem being the opposition. Since they realize they don't have the majority, they have chosen to boycott elections. A certain number of opposition leaders do participate in the elections. I mean, the last election, 2018, Maduro got 67.5% of the vote, something like that. Then one of the challengers got 21%, and another challenger got 11%, because it was an election with multiple candidates. But the more America-friendly candidates, Leopoldo Lopez or Ledesma or Julio Borges, these people were not participating in the elections. And of course, Juan Guaido was not participating in the presidential election because he was a total unknown. I mean, Juan Guaido is a lackey of Washington. Juan Guaido is a product of U.S. Media manipulation, and he is a pretty face that the United States thought that by giving him so much support that he would carry out the regime change that Washington wanted. The idea is that
Does he get a and does he get a bit of left wing cred because isn't his party actually a left party or it's a member of an international bloc of like social democrats?
well, I mean, he is in Voluntad Popular. He is in a uh, shall we say, a right wing political party that has a certain number of social elements. But it is essentially a right wing party. And
Okay.
what it was trying to do was the classical right wing coup d'etat. And let's not forget, in the year 2002, the United States, the CIA, and with the connivance of some other states, carried out a coup d'etat.
Yeah,
And
Brits.
for
Yeah,
48
yeah.
hours,
Britain and
48
Canada were
hours,
definitely
Hugo
involved.
Chavez was out of office, and he was supposed to be killed. I mean, if he'd been killed, of course, then the Bolivarian Revolution would have ended then. But he wasn't killed. I mean, he was enormously popular, especially not only with the people, he was extremely popular with the people, but he was also very popular with the army, which was not the case with Evo Morales in Bolivia. But back to 2002, it was the army that found out where he was being kept and liberated him. And then within 48 hours, um, Chavez was back in Miraflores, which is the presidential palace. But what is important to note is that these parties, the right wing parties, in 2002 all supported the coup d'etat, and they call themselves democratic. I mean, there's nothing more undemocratic than a putsch, than a vulgar Latin American coup d'etat, of which there have been too many. So, uh, Voluntad Popular and all of these other parties have and continue to applaud the 2002 conspiracy against Chavez. Interesting to note, when Pedro Carmona became for 48 hours president of Venezuela in 2002, the first thing he did was to abolish the National Assembly, because the
Yeah.
National Assembly was in the hands of Chavistas. He abolished the Supreme Court. He actually fired most governors of the 26 provinces in Venezuela. And in
And his supporters were all cheering democracy, democracy,
yes,
democracy.
and with one signature, he abrogated 49 pieces of social legislation that Chavez had enacted. So that, of course, is what is in store for Venezuela if this puppet Juan Guaido is successful in his regime change plans. The first thing that will be done is, the great bonanza for U.S. business. Everything will be privatized and sold cheap to the U.S. transnational corporations, and U.S. investors will be able to come in and just take everything. It's going to be, the great looting. And that's, but of course, those who will participate in the looting from these right wing parties will enrich themselves enough at the expense of the masses. But what I told members of the opposition is, don't underestimate Chavismo. Don't underestimate how deep these people feel committed to these social changes. If you ever topple the Maduro government, you will be the president of all of Venezuela. But that includes being the president of 8, 9, or 10 million Chavistas. And what are you going to do with them? You can't kill them. They're not going to go away. So they're going to call for general strikes. They're going to do all sorts of things to frustrate your government. So unless you stretch the hand and try to reach a sensible compromise with this block, shall we say, there's a block of, uh, shall we say, 40 to 50 to even 55% of the population that, in spite of everything, believes in Chavismo. And you cannot govern Venezuela without them. So
Now there was now there was an economic now there was an economic crisis that preceded the sanctions. And so, in your opinion, in your assessment, when you went to Venezuela, was the economic crisis because Saudi Arabia and the United States decided to change the price of oil? And do you think that is what had? So, do you think a lot of the economic crisis in Venezuela is all externally because of that, as well as some government mismanagement and, of course, government corruption, which Hugo Chavez did fail to overcome?
Well, if the government of Venezuela under Chavez, as and Chavez wanted to do it, uh, had been, shall we say, more wise, they would have diversified the economy. Uh, Obviously, if 95% of your foreign currency depends on the sale of oil, you are extremely vulnerable to sanctions. You're extremely vulnerable to a government that will hurt you. So you must care for uh, self sufficiency in at least the essentials. Uh, if I can criticize Chavez and Maduro for one thing, I criticize them for ignoring realpolitik, as Saddam Hussein ignored realpolitik. When Saddam Hussein, like Gaddafi, wanted to sell their oil in euros and not in dollars, move away from the dollar dependency, that has consequences. That reminds me of Thucydides, of this famous book, The Peloponnesian War, written by General Thucydides, who participated in the war. And he describes in chapter 16 how the hegemon, Athens, wanted to bring the island of Melos into the Delian League against Sparta. And the Melians just wanted to be neutral. They wanted to be out of it. And the Athenian general told the Melians very clearly, look, it's not an option. You cannot remain neutral. You're either with us or against us. No other option. And the Melians believed that that was unjust and that they had a right, an ontological right to be independent, and that they did not have to do the bidding of Athens. And the general told the Melians, the powerful do what they want, and the weak suffer as they must. Still, the Melians did not see the writing on the wall. And Athens killed them off. Genocide. It was one of the first genocides in history. And if you're going to challenge the hegemon, in this case, the United States, make sure that you can survive the sanctions. And I'm talking about not only financial blockade, not only sanctions against individuals or against corporations or against whatever. I'm talking about a whole system of, shall we say, hybrid measures that the United States employs against countries that don't do its bidding. I mean, the United States can veto any help from the International Monetary Fund to a country. If the United States doesn't want the IMF to lend money to Venezuela, the IMF won't. If the United States doesn't want the World Bank to finance a project in Venezuela, the World Bank won't. There are many, many ways in which this economic war, this non-conventional war, is waged. And
Then what could have Chavez or not even Chavez? I mean, because we are talking about the present situation. What could have Maduro have done to have avoided the economic warfare that he finds himself in, because it seems to me as if the kind of oligarchs he's dealing with are. I mean, there's an old saying that you can't reason with unreasonable people, and it seems as if, even if Chavez subsidized oil, allowed, some kind of a free market, that they could still make a pretty good profit. But the
Oh,
social contract is, funding, education, funding, a single payer healthcare system, and giving, the poor more opportunities to yeah, have a better social mobility so that they can, uplift themselves out of poverty. It seems to me as if, Maduro, I mean, I think he more or less continued Chavez's policies, but these oligarchs, these oil garks, simply, don't want to play ball. They don't want that social contract. So, they do the economic sabotage, and they have their
yeah.
friends in the U.S., Canada, France, the European Union,
And
Britain.
economic sabotage that I would actually term treason. I would actually term what Guaido has been doing and what his predecessors have been doing. They have given aid and comfort to a foreign power, and a foreign power that has only one interest: to loot the country. And it makes me think, in a way, of Quisling in Norway in the Second World War. Um, I think that many in the Venezuelan opposition are Quislings, are traitors to the Venezuelan people, because they're actually calling for greater economic sanctions against Venezuela in the hope that the government will actually collapse. Now, these economic sanctions that have been imposed on Venezuela have already killed probably.
And when did the sanctions start on Venezuela? Because I
Uh, uh,
uh, because didn't Obama actually start sanctions on Venezuela when Chavez was still in power, or did it all really start with Maduro? And the opposition will say, and their supporters in the West implementing the sanctions are saying, well, we're putting sanctions on Venezuela because Maduro is a communist dictator, and he's running a narco state, and he's oppressing his people. That's why we're putting the sanctions on.
well, the economic war against Venezuela started on day one, since
When Chavez became president.
when Chavez became president. As I said, the non conventional economic warfare, the uh, hybrid warfare through the IMF and World Bank, etc., that has been in place since 1999. The sanctions are actually the tip of the iceberg. Sanctions are the most visible, uh, and they're not linked. I mean, there's a whole narrative that unfortunately the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal echo all the nonsense that comes from the State Department and the Pentagon is being echoed by these so-called watchdogs of democracy. But the narrative is that the government is corrupt, and that the government has something to do with drug trafficking. Well, if you're looking for drug trafficking, just go on the website of the United Nations Drug and Crime Office in Vienna, whose director, Pino Arlacchi, from Italy, Now I believe he's a member of the European Parliament. He was an assistant secretary general. No, take that back. Under secretary general of the United Nations for many years. And then he retired from the United Nations. And in any event, in his function as head of the Drug Office of the United Nations, he issued several reports where it's clear that 90% of the drug business is Colombian. I mean,
I would even put I
Venezuela,
would I would even put Mexico and Honduras in that.
Venezuela is de minimis. There, Venezuela has little piece in the international drug business, which is not condoned by Maduro, which was never condoned by Chavez. So calling Maduro a narco dictator is completely gratuitous because there's nothing to back it up. And Pino Arlachi recently, if you go on the internet, you will find it. He issued a statement that must be about 2 months ago, saying these accusations against Maduro don't have anything to back them up. And all the time that I was chief of the United Nations Drug Office, we had excellent relations with Venezuela, and Venezuela was not one of our concerns with regard to drug trafficking. So stop this demonization, this defamation of Maduro. Alas, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal call him a narco dictator, and this idiot of Marco Rubio, this dumb senator from Florida. I mean, it's so primitive it's so laughable that you wouldn't believe it unless you had actually seen it. But going back to this narrative that the sanctions are targeted sanctions and the sanctions only started against Maduro, it's not true. The economic war was there long before, and the sabotage was there long before. Um, of course, there is corruption in uh, Venezuela, as there is a lot more corruption in Colombia, in Honduras, in Mexico, in Brazil. The corruption scandals in Brazil and Ecuador and in Peru are much more serious than the corruption in Venezuela. I spent hours with the prosecutor general in Caracas and saw, their investigations. They have a very robust anti-corruption program. But the fact that there's still corruption does not mean that the corruption is official or that it is attributable to Maduro. Maduro is against corruption, and his attorney general is prosecuting it actively. But you're not going to eradicate corruption from Latin America as you're not going to eradicate corruption from the United States. And you're not going to eradicate corruption from Italy or from the mafia, etc. I mean, it's there. And my concern is that, as I said before, we're swimming in an ocean of lies, and this false narrative that we are fed by the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal actually has an impact, because a lot of people, including my colleague rapporteurs, believe part of it. And So instead of coming out and saying, as I did, stop this nonsense in order to help the Venezuelan people, what you need is to lift the sanctions, to let the country buy and sell like any other country in the world, to respect freedom of trade, to respect freedom of navigation, and the so called humanitarian crisis will end. The humanitarian crisis is artificial. Of course, when I was there in November, December 2017, and I went into the supermarkets, etc., and I saw that there was plenty of everything,
Hmm.
I said, I've been lied to. You know, I went to Venezuela expecting to find empty shelves all over, to finding people doing, long lines and looking into garbage pails for food, etc. None of that. On the other hand, the sanctions are biting and have bitten. And over the last 3 years, the situation in Venezuela has significantly degraded. And what is amazing is that although the situation has significantly degraded, the people have not turned against Maduro. Because the people, and in order to get an impression of what was going on, I did something very, shall we say,
Sneaky.
unusual, inappropriate. I removed my bow tie, put on a guayabera and jeans, and went walking the streets to talk to people in my native Spanish. Because if I go around with a bow tie in a dark suit, people are already going to say, who the hell is that? They're not going to speak freely. So I wanted to get an impression of what was going on. And I did get an impression of what was going on. And the fact is that the common man, the population, blames not Maduro, they blame Washington. The bad guy in this story is Trump, not Maduro. So, what Trump was planning to do to make the Venezuelans suffer so that the Venezuelans turn against Maduro has backfired because they hate the United States all the more. And I said to the opposition, look, guys, if you topple Maduro and you take over and you do away with the social legislation, you're going to find yourself in a civil war. They won't put up with it. This is quite unlike the situation in 1970 to 1973 when the United States imposed sanctions on Salvador Allende's Chile, when the United States conducted a vicious economic war against Salvador Allende. And the
So
amazing thing is
that's
that
so that said, uh, it sounds to me as if you're saying that there is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, but the humanitarian crisis is a Western economic warfare with with a Venezuelan opposition backed by powerful interests and backed by Western interests to overthrow a leader who you say, whether you agree with him or not, whether you find him competent or enough, but is a Democrat.
uh, exactly. The humanitarian crisis is
The
external.
sanctions.
The sanctions, actually worse than the sanctions, because just simply to say you can't travel, you can't come to the United States, etc. um, will arrest you if you come within your jurisdiction. That doesn't bite. What does bite is when you have legislation according to which any enterprise, any bank doing business with Venezuela will have to pay to the U.S. Department of the Treasury penalties of 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, 1 million, uh, uh, just for doing business with Venezuela. So most investors, most entrepreneurs, most people engaged in trade uh, have a risk assessment. When it becomes so risky to do business in Venezuela, they drop Venezuela, and that's the end of it. They look for a different market where they can make a profit, make an easy profit. I mean, the sanctions are so ridiculous that I'm a Swiss and an American. I cannot open a bank account with the Raiffeisen Bank because I'm an American. And I have an account with the UBS, but I wanted to open a different account. I said, no, we won't open it. Why? Because the UBS and the Raiffeisen are commercial enterprises, and dealing with the United States is a big Olympic headache, and they don't want it. And any businessman who wants to sell something to Venezuela, say this Swiss company doing ventilators, they dropped it. I mean, there was even a Swiss movement here to collect money to send aid to Cuba and to Venezuela. The UBS refused the transfer. They will not transfer the money. So when you are excluded from the international banking system, when you cannot issue bonds for your national debt, when you cannot buy, Venezuela is being supported, most people don't know that, uh, by the United Nations. The United Nations, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the United Nations Development Program, make sure that food and medicine comes in through the United Nations because it cannot go directly. It cannot go directly to Maduro. It has to be filtered through the United Nations so that you don't have a massive famine in Venezuela. And one of my achievements, I would say, when I did my report in Venezuela, and actually when I personally negotiated with the government, was I called in all of the United Nations agencies, and I said, look, you don't have to like Mr. Maduro. You don't have to support Mr. Maduro. But you do have a responsibility for the Venezuelan people. So you have to give advisory services and technical assistance to the government so that they have access to medicines, they have access to foods, etc. Shortly after my visit, already new MOUs, new agreements were made between FAO and the government and practically all the agencies, because I had UN Women there, I had UNHCR, etc. And talking about UNHCR, I mean, they tell you, oh, 3 million Venezuelans have left the country. By the way, about 100,000 have come back now because of COVID. But 3 million Venezuelans have left the country. And I say, yes, as a direct result of the sanctions. If you impose sanctions and that causes massive unemployment, you have a family, you have a wife, you have 2 kids, you have to feed them. What are you going to do? If you can, you go over the border and you try to get a job elsewhere. So you don't have here a migration caused by the mismanagement of the economy, by the stupidity of Mr. Maduro. You have here a migration caused by the most draconian system of sanctions and financial blockade that you can think of. And as I said, that was tried before. It's the same blueprint. Nixon called in Kissinger in September 1970. September 1970. And he told Kissinger in so many words, we will not tolerate an alternative economic system in Latin America. And we shall make the Chilean economy scream. I mean, I have it written down, facsimile of the document. And by the way, this fellow Kornblue, Paul Kornblue, wrote a book called the Pinochet Papers, and those were the measures taken by the United States and by the CIA, etc., to undermine Allende. And of course, when it didn't work, after 3 years of economic war against Allende, then you had to use more muscle. So they got Mr. Pinochet to come and kill off Mr. Allende and to introduce Chile to 17 years of torture and 17 years of brutal dictatorship.
Well, I think you've already described some of the sanctions that have been put in place in Venezuela, but just to remind the audience, so you really do think that so you really do think from the assessment that you've made when you went to Venezuela that this is the same old colonial Cold War Western meddling in a social democracy that's taking place in Venezuela. That this isn't that the sanctions put on place in Venezuela are not to overthrow some dictator. That this is actually that it's actually cover for imperialism, for a war for oil, a war for mining, and a war on democracy.
It's very much a war on, shall we say, local democracy. What does democracy mean as a term of art? I mean, you would think that democracy means rule by the people. Demos is the people, and kratos is rule. But if the people want to have their own government, and that government doesn't follow the orders of Washington, then Washington will not tolerate it. As Nixon told Kissinger, we will not tolerate this other system in Chile because it can be copied. If Chile succeeds in giving education and health care to its people, then we, the United States, that has a privatized system, and we don't succeed in that, we will look bad. So the United States, since long before the Monroe Doctrine, the United States has controlled the capitals of Latin America. Latin America is the backyard of the United States, and that's why.
Don't forget Canada as well.
Yeah. Actually, now Trudeau and Trump are clashing with mutual sanctions or mutual economic warfare. But the great, uh, shall we say, challenge to this hegemony of the United States was Cuba, 1959. That Cuba would dare uh, establish a completely different economic system than Washington wanted. And the amazing thing is that nobody learns anything in Washington because, notwithstanding the sanctions against Cuba that now have lasted for 60 years, that is basically three generations of sanctions, and the financial blockade and the enormous economic damage that the United States has wreaked on Cuba, the Cuban people have not risen against Diaz Canel, as they did not rise against Raul Castro, as they did not rise against Fidel Castro. So the sanctions system has totally failed in its supposed purpose to cause regime change, but it has caused enormous suffering to the Cuban people. But the Cuban people are a proud people. And for them, their honor is more important than being lackeys to Washington. And I've been to Cuba 5 times, and there again, spoken with the common people, and they have adjusted. They accept that there are certain amenities that they cannot afford, that they do not get because of the sanctions. But they are happy enough as Cubans and proud enough as Cubans, and they're not about to lick the boots of Uncle Sam. And that's essentially it.
But
It's a,
now going back
it's a
to
question
Venezuela.
of personal honor. I mean, some people have none. And that is one of the downsides of capitalism. When you reduce everything to mammon, you reduce everything to money, then other things which are very human and necessary, such as uh, conscience, honor, identity, those things are still there, latent. And uh, money alone is not going to make you uh, happy. I mean, happiness will come from harmony in your family life, in your personal relationships. That is what is actually humanly meaningful, not whether you have one more gadget or whether you have the latest Nike sneakers or you have the most advanced Apple computer or whatever. So uh, Washington has not learned that. And there was, back in the year 2001, there was an event that I remember quite distinctly. Um, and you probably, again, you're so young that you probably don't know it. Elian Gonzalez. I don't know whether Elian Gonzalez means anything to you. Elian Gonzalez was a little boy, 4 years old. His mother had separated from her husband and taken the boy, and she went on a raft from Cuba to Florida. The raft capsized. She died. And then the boy was taken by some uncle in Florida. And there was a tremendous effort so that the boy would stay in the United States.
Yeah, Clinton was still in power, right? With
Right.
Janet Reno, the Attorney General.
Exactly. Janet Reno, a good graduate of Harvard Law School. But going back to Elian, the father, when he learned that his son had survived the capsizing of the boat and that he was alive, living with an uncle, he requested permission to enter the United States to come pick up his child. Now, there was a big, long court battle about it. And he was allowed to come to the United States with his new wife, with his new family, with the parents of his new wife, so that they could have easily stayed in the United States. They offered this man and their families everything: a house, jobs, money. And the father said, "You cannot buy me. There's only one thing that I want. One. It's my son. That's all. I want to take him back to Cuba so that he grows up like a Cuban." And so this had been first page news in the New York Times for weeks. And the moment Elian Gonzalez flies to Cuba with his father, the news completely disappeared. Meaning, this man has tried, in his very humble way, teach the American people that there are things that are more important than money, things that are more important than playing Washington's game. And as I said, nobody learned anything from the story.
Oh, but what's interesting is when certain people recall that saga to me, I think from the news they read was that it was wrong to have sent the boy back to Cuba because Cuba is a communist tyranny, and his mother had fled that communist tyranny, so therefore he should have stayed in the U.S. and not gone back to Cuba. Uh, what do you say to that?
Well, that is a result of the intensive media manipulation of the story. The narrative was completely false, and my experience was that even friends of mine, members of the Secretariat of the Inter American Commission on Human Rights, intelligent people, liberal people, thought that, yes, after all, maybe Elian should have stayed in the United States. And I said, you're missing the point. I mean, this most fundamental right of the family, this most fundamental right of a father to bring up his child uh, in his identity, in his country, that certainly higher value than just money that was being offered to this man. I mean, they would really try to bribe him to stay in the United States. And he refused the bribe and he said, "No, thank you, I'm going." But as I said, even a good friend of mine who is a member of the Democratic Party in the United States, who votes uh, Democratic and who would have voted and certainly voted Clinton and certainly would have voted Bernie Sanders, this friend of mine thought that Elian probably would have done better staying in the United States. By the way, he's an engineer. He is an engineer, the same as our friend Juan Guaido is. Yes,
Well, that's
he's an
interesting. Well,
industrial
then,
engineer.
all right. Well, two last questions on Venezuela before I get to two other topics I want to talk to you about before time runs out. is so you've described the sanctions, and there's been sanctions on medicine, so Venezuelans can't get medicine. There's sanctions on people who just even want to start a business in Venezuela, which would actually help out the economic crisis. So there is a humanitarian crisis, but that is because of the sanctions, not so much the mismanagement of the economy by Maduro, which I think we both established earlier is more externally because Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states changed the price of oil. But the Venezuelans also failed to diversify their economy. And yeah, so it's a combination of those two things, right?
Uh, I would say 80% of the economic crisis, which has grown into a humanitarian crisis, albeit not in 2017. When I wrote my report 2017, 2018, there was no humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. I mean, that was a chimera built by the hegemon and by the corporate media that echoes what the hegemon wants. But this crisis in Venezuela is 80% the result of outside forces. Uh, there is mismanagement in Venezuela. I actually told some Venezuelan officials, look, guys, you're a bunch of ideologues and you don't have enough technocrats. What you need more than anything is technocrats so that you can run the government more effectively. There are too many military in the ministries, for instance. But of course, the military are reliable. And that is what Evo Morales didn't have. Evo Morales suffered a coup d'etat because he did not have the army supporting him, believing in him, whereas the military do believe in Maduro and they do believe in Chavez. So the thing is the solution to the problem. What is the solution? Lift the sanctions, lift the economic blockade, let the country function like anybody else, and things will get back to normal because Venezuela not only has the largest oil reserves in the world, it has, I believe, the second largest gold reserves on the ground. I mean, not in the banks, because that's one of the really obscene things that the Bank of England would steal billion and a half of Venezuelan money that is needed to buy medicine, etc., and will not give it to Maduro, or that the United States would confiscate the Venezuelan assets in the United States, notably the oil refineries, etc., that are being now supposedly transferred to Juan Guaido. There again, an absolute absurdity in international law. I mean, you cannot recognize someone like Guaido who has zero legitimacy and zero power. I mean, the government is the one that holds the purse. The government is the one that has the police and the army, etc. Guaido has none of that. I mean, it's absurd, but then the American lawyers and the American courts, unfortunately, betraying the ethos of the profession, have gone along with Washington and allowed Washington to get away with a complete undermining of the rule of law, not only in Venezuela, in the United States. Because in order to maintain the farce, in order to maintain what Trump has been doing in Venezuela, it has needed the U.S. courts, and the U.S. courts have actually buckled down to the wishes of the oligarchs in the United States, the same as the courts would buckle down under Stalin or under Hitler or under other leaders. So, I mean, I have a very great sense of sadness when I think, having studied at Harvard Law School, having seen other graduates of Harvard Law School betraying the profession and betraying those values that we are ostensibly there to defend. So, next question, because I mean, time is running.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Okay, well then, so before I get to these, so one last thing then about Venezuela. Are the sanctions put in place on Venezuela as deadly as the monstrous genocidal sanctions that were placed in Iraq in the 1990s in an effort to disarm Saddam Hussein's WMDs, which the West gave him,
No, no, they're
and all
worse.
that?
The sanctions against Venezuela are distinctly worse than the sanctions against Iraq. The
Really?
only thing is that I would say Venezuela has improvised incredibly well to survive the sanctions. And Venezuela has enjoyed the economic support of China and of Russia. And that counts a lot. And without China
So have Russia and China been acting as the upholders of international law, protecting Venezuela or trying to protect Venezuela from the sanctions of mass destructions and and the regime change efforts?
yeah, without them, of course, Venezuela would have folded long ago. I mean, the United States knows that China has huge investments in Venezuela, and China is not about to lose those investments. So it's complicated to overthrow Maduro because you're going to upset the economic interests of both China and Russia. But the one aspect that most people do not know, because the mainstream media doesn't report on it, although it was public, on the 13th of February of this year, Jorge Arriaza, the foreign minister of Venezuela, went to The Hague, went to the International Criminal Court, and delivered to Fatou Bensouda, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, a very well prepared file, and I know who prepared it, on the violation of Article 7 of the Statute of Rome by the United States and the other countries imposing sanctions, because sanctions that kill, and sanctions that kill in the magnitude that these sanctions have killed in Venezuela, clearly constitute a crime against humanity under Article 7. This case is being investigated on, but of course, you don't read about that in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, or in the Wall Street Journal. And on the 24th of February this year, Arriaza spoke in the Human Rights Council, announced that this case was now sub judice, that was pending before the ICC. A so-called side event, that is a panel, was held at the United Nations. I participated in the panel. to discuss the implications of the ICC taking the case. So, uh, if the ICC were to come out clearly and say the sanctions constitute a crime against humanity, that will put not only the United States in a difficult position, but it will put everybody else that has been conniving with the United States in these crimes. Canada, the United Kingdom, many member states of the European Union
Yeah.
will place them in a difficult position because the European Union uh, keeps self-praising itself as being the beacon of human rights, being, the promoters of human rights, when the Europeans actually bear uh, really horrendous responsibility for the crimes of colonialism, the crimes of imperialism, and for that one crime, which I like to call the revolt against international law and international order, that greatest violation of international morality since the Nuremberg Principles, and I'm talking about the 20th of March of 2003, when George Walker Bush assaulted the Iraqi people and waged a war that by now has cost over 1 million lives with horrendous war crimes. Huh? I mean,
So you put Venezuela on par with
Fallujah was
that.
genocide, and Halita also was genocide. These were in 2004, 2005. There have been a couple of documentaries put together on that, and it's shocking the level of criminality of that war in 2003 and follows. And what is particularly painful for an international lawyer like me is to realize that's why I call it a revolt. It was not only the United States, it was the so called coalition of the willing. You had 43 states participating in a conspiracy to destroy international law, a conspiracy to destroy the UN Charter, a conspiracy completely incompatible with Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. I mean, you had the United Kingdom, you had Spain, you have Italy. I remember hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Italians went on the streets in Milan and in Rome. Spaniards in Barcelona, Spaniards in Madrid, Brits in London and in Manchester and in Southampton, protesting against this war. And the so-called democratic leaders of these countries, Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, Jose Maria Aznar in Spain, Tony Blair in England, dragged their populations into an illegal criminal enterprise. That was baffling, the level of criminality that entailed. And in the only reasonable person at the time was Jacques Chirac, the French, who is said to have said that George Walker Bush is totally mad. And he just simply didn't agree with it. And he said France will not be part of this. It's like in the assault against Libya in 2011.
So you think Venezuela that this is another imperial project. This is another war for oil, which the anti-war movement, the anti-imperialist movement, should be getting into the streets and demanding not in our name, like they did with Iraq. Libya, not so much. Although now you mean you'd have to be a fool to say that the Libya NATO war there was a war of liberation and democracy. That was another war for oil.
Of course, it was a war for oil, and it has caused 9 years of chaos in that country. I mean, there again, there is international legal responsibility, both civil and penal. I would like to see Nicolas Sarkozy in the International Criminal Court accused of crimes against humanity. I'm not interested in his corruption affairs or in his
Gaddafi giving him bundles of money for his election campaign, and then he later murders Gaddafi.
Absolutely uninteresting. What is sad is that he, together with the United States, spearheaded the assault on the people of Libya and the destruction of a system, an alternative system of social economics that actually provided for education and healthcare and a high standard of living for all Libyans. Libyans have been living in hell since 2011, thanks to Nicolas Sarkozy and thanks to, I hate to say it, Barack Obama. I mean, this was a classical war for oil. Classical. So first Iraq, then Libya, and now Venezuela. But again, you have the corporate media misinforming the population, trying to make it palatable that regime change in Venezuela means human rights.